Listening is both kind of simple. In other words, you do kind of have to shut your mouth and open your ears to a certain extent, right, to do it well. But also, it's highly contingent on the context. Who is it that you're talking with? What's the relational history between you and that individual, and then what happened before, and what is likely to happen afterward. What are the goals that these two people or these multiple people have in mind, right? And so communication in and of itself, as a phenomenon, is quite complex.
This sounds like a simple question, but it obviously eludes a lot of us. So could you tell us, why is listening an underrated skill in business and entrepreneurship, and how can leaders start developing it intentionally?
Yeah, I mean, so it's so very interesting that, when you ask people how is listening important to your work, it's universal. People, hands down, absolutely 100%. It's very, very important. And they'll have some specific examples about, how that skill is important. But if you ask a follow-up question, which is how much time, resources, and energy do you put into honing that skill, right? It's very little. There may be a unit in a full day workshop or an executive weekend retreat. There may be like a 2 hour session about listening. In the undergraduate textbook space, there's usually a chapter on listening in your basic communication textbook. And very very few people have taken a course on how to listen well, which that's the imbalance, right? That, to use a term that you used a minute ago, right? So why is that? Well, I think first and foremost, listening suffers, like a lot of other socially positive skills, from a bias, where it's called the better than average effect, where people believe that they are better than most people. When you ask people, are you a good driver? Everyone raises their hand. When you ask people, are you a good listener? Everyone raises their hand. And yet, when you ask them if other people are good at that skill, they're very sort of top of mind, sort of, oh, absolutely not. People are really bad, right? So when I misunderstand you, it's because you're a bad speaker. And when you misunderstand me, it's because you're a bad listener, right? It's never my fault, right? It's never my fault. And that's because we live in our own head. We live through our own experiences. We only know what we know. We only experience what we experience. And the ability to get out of ourselves and understand that other people don't see and hear and experience the world in the same way. I think very few people either have time or have benefited from reflecting on that. I see a pretty big difference between people who have been successful leaders and those who are emerging as leaders. The people that that we tend to point at as high quality leaders tend to be high quality listeners, whereas the people who tend to be emerging leaders tend to be learning that they've got to speak a lot less and listen a lot more if they're going to move into that leadership space. So there's a lot of different answers to that question about why it might be. I think first and foremost, it's just the nature of our human existence, where we assume the way that we do things is the way all ought to do things. And it's really hard for us to step outside of ourselves and recognize that other people may have viable and valid experiences of and ways of interacting in the world, that we can learn from.
Have you encountered resistance when introducing listening intelligence in organizations? And if so, how did you overcome the skepticism?
Yeah, I mean, early in my career when I was publishing, I got a lot of resistance from reviewers, peer reviewers, right, other academics who would say, "Oh, we already know these things," right? And so I would have to write an entire other paper to convince them that, in fact, we don't know a lot of the things that we assume about what high quality listening means. Inside of organizations, I experienced similar kinds of resistance insofar as people will say, "Oh, we don't really have those problems," or that's something that other, or we're a family, right? We work out our differences and so forth. And yet, if or we are a listening organization. Of course, we're a listening organization. And so, if an organization is going to claim that they're a listening organization, or that they have a strong architecture of listening, I would just sort of challenge them to look at any internal or public facing document that describes job description or that describes the processes through which decisions are made and so forth, and look for terms that indicate anything about rules, processes, procedures, and policies for listening specifically, right? My hunch and based on what I've observed in organizations is there are many more policies, procedures, and explicit rules and regulations for speaking than there are for listening. Very few organizations have any language around what it means to quote unquote listen well. And if work teams are also honest with themselves, they'll recognize that most of their decision making criteria are implicit and perhaps not shared across everybody on that work team. So a lot of the things that we assume are just that. There are assumptions, and they're not always necessarily grounded in fact.
I think the older you get, the more startling it is how much you've been assuming the whole time. It somehow seems to hold up, but yeah, I definitely, that resonates. Let's get back to that question about how one ought to approach situations as a listener. Could you talk about that for us?
It's funny that in this culture, in this language, and this is true of other languages as well, we have a phrase that goes, think before you speak. And yet we don't have a similar phrase that says, think before you listen. And yet, listening constitutes the majority of our communication, the time we spent communicating. When you look at studies, and they've been conducted since the 1920s, 1930s, in a variety of contexts, and you could quibble with the specific numbers, but we spend upwards of 75 to 80% of our day in some kind of communication, whether that communication is face-to-face, synchronous, or asynchronous over email. And in those moments when we communicate, again, estimates range anywhere from 45 to 65% of our communication time is spent listening and not speaking. So if around half of the time we spend communicating, which constitutes a majority of the time that we spend at work, if over half of the time that we spend is spent on listening, then why aren't we taking care to really think strategically about how we're showing up in that role? If we're thinking strategically about how we're phrasing messages or tailoring content or writing the 3-sentence mission statement, why aren't we spending the same amount of time thinking strategically about how am I as an individual listening to those that I'm responsible for hearing? And how is my organization as an entity? How is my team as an entity listening, right? As you scale listening from the individual or interpersonal level to the organizational level, you have all kinds of other kind of problems like technology and all these sorts of things. But you can still ask those same questions about an organization that you can about an individual, which is, what are the habits of listening that this organization tends to have? And when do they serve us well? And when do they challenge us, or when do they sort of send us down the wrong road? And that sort of first and foremost, again, if you're talking about listening intelligence, it's that awareness, right? Becoming aware of how you show up as a listener and making that more complex than, what you learned in kindergarten: crisscross applesauce, eyes on me, mouth shut, ears open, these sorts of things. And make it really complex in terms of not just ears on, but ears on and filters. Which filters are am I using to hear the world? Then I think that's step one, is just that sort of awareness, that mindfulness, whatever you want to call it. That in fact I am showing up in a particular way, and maybe I ought to show up in a different way based on my goals and the goals of the other individual.
I think in casual, and this is purely based on like my own observations, so it's not like I'm not citing any data here, but I think there's more of a desire to speak in casual conversations, assert myself, my presence or whatever, and a timidness or kind of nervousness when given the opportunity on a stage, like in front of a lot of people. We don't usually see people like listening on stage, like, oh, I'm so nervous about listening on stage or something like that. But then this, so I don't know if you kind of follow my messed up kind of sentence here. Can you talk about that inversion between a desire to insert yourself in small stakes kind of conversations and yet a pulling back when it could actually be more significant on like on a stage or in a public kind of setting?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I mean, there is some research that suggests that you can not only have public speaking anxiety, but also what's called informational reception apprehension or listening anxiety, where you are anxious or reticent or otherwise worried about receiving information. And this is more than worried about receiving bad news, or if you're a teenager, worried about getting in trouble with your parents, or if you're a parent, worried about what your teenager may tell you about whatever this or the other. There are clear situations where it's anxiety provoking to be a recipient of information, right? And we can think about all kinds of contexts where that's relevant. Similarly, we can be reticent when you're a public speaker. But I think to your point, we're we're much there's much more attention paid to fear of speaking in front of large crowds than there is fear of speaking one-on-one or with small groups. Although there's some documented evidence that some people do experience more anxiety when they're one-on-one as opposed to with a large group. So it's both an individual difference as well as a situational sort of manifestation. It's also true. There's some sales data out there that suggests sort of the quote unquote best salespeople have like a 60-40 split, listening 60% of the time, speaking 40% of the time. And so there's some evidence that that high performers, if you will, do more listening than they do speaking, and this is particularly true in interpersonal or small group situations, and not necessarily relevant for speaking to a large group.
And on that note, what's the most surprising thing you've learned about listening?
The most surprising thing that I've learned about listening is that I'm terrible at it, and that I need every day to do at least one thing to try to be better.
And on that, what's a personal habit or routine that keeps your listening skills sharp, or in this case, works towards making them sharper?
I've always got my wife in the back of my head telling me that I can do better, and challenging me to be a better version of myself. So that keeps me motivated, even if I don't tell her in the moment that I appreciate it. Hopefully she knows that I appreciate her continued encouragement.
Well, I hope she sees this podcast.
So maybe.
What's the one message or piece of advice you'd like every entrepreneur listening today to take away about the power of listening?
Yeah, it's more than a trite statement to say listening matters. And I would maybe put it as a challenge, which is what where in the next 4 quarters of this year might this entrepreneur or this business leader carve out 10 minutes a day to work on their listening.
Well, you are the chief listening officer, running on 8 years now at the Listen First Project. That's listenfirstproject.org. Is there anywhere that you would like to point people, or any last words you wanted to say?
Yeah, they can go to my website, grahambodie.com, as well. It's more of an academic, so published papers and so forth. But there's a contact page there if people are interested in asking me questions or starting a conversation. I'd love that.
Well, thank you for talking to us today, Graham. It was a pleasure listening to you.
Awesome. Thanks for the opportunity, David.